Hello, everyone. This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today we have William Tronsor, PAAT and PAAT Fellow here at DRNY. He's here to discuss his fellowship project to support Native Americans with disabilities throughout New York State. How you doing, Will?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Very good, thank you. So today, can you tell us about the indigenous community here in New York State?
Sure. There is actually a large and diverse population of Native Americans living in New York State. New York is home to 8 federally recognized indigenous nations and 1 state-recognized indigenous nation. The 8 federally recognized indigenous nations are Tuscarora, the Tonawanda Band of Seneca, the Seneca Nation of Indians, Onondaga, St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, Oneida, Cayuga, and Shinnecock Nation. And that just leaves the Uncochac Indian Nation, which is a state-recognized indigenous nation. There are also many Native Americans living in urban areas throughout New York State who are no longer living on their nation's territories but are still part of one of the 573 federally recognized tribes throughout the country. For example, New York City has the largest population of Native Americans living within any city in the U.S., with a population of over 111,000 Native Americans living in the city.
So when you talked about the federally recognized nations, you mentioned the Tonawanda Band of Seneca, as well as the Seneca Nation of Indians. Can you explain what the difference is between these 2 federally recognized bands of the Seneca Nation?
Of course. So the Seneca Nation of Indians created a Republican Constitution back in 1848, electing a council and executive officials to govern their lands. The Tonawanda Band of Seneca opted out of participating in the Republic and decided to maintain their more traditional tribal government. This schism of the Seneca Nation occurred in part due to some internal conflicts stemming from different treaties of Buffalo Creek and the sale of the Buffalo Creek Reservation land. So in 1857, the Tonawanda Band of Seneca signed a treaty with the United States on their own, and that was how they became independent of the Seneca Nation of Indians. The new treaty with the U.S. allowed the Tonawanda Band of Seneca to buy back some land that was sold without their permission. They re-established their traditional Seneca government that existed prior to 1848. One thing that it is important for me to say is that what I just explained is a very condensed version of why there are 2 bands of Seneca currently.
So is there anything else that you would find important to let us know regarding these 2 nations?
In particular to those 2 particular nations, not really, but there is one other thing that I would like to say, and that is that the upper part of New York State is home to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or as the French called them, the Iroquois Nation. The Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. It is one of the oldest participatory democracies in history. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is made up of 6 indigenous nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations. Each nation maintains their own government and maintains their own affairs, but the nations allow the Grand Council of the Haudenosaunee to deal with larger issues affecting all of the nations within the Confederacy. If you think that sounds similar to the federal system that we have here in the U.S., you're not wrong. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy's Great Law of Peace actually influenced our Constitution, and in 1988, Congress even passed a resolution acknowledging the Haudenosaunee's contribution to American democracy. How much of an influence the Haudenosaunee had is still open to debate to this day, but it is clear that the Haudenosaunee had an influence on our federalist system.
Well, that's really interesting, and it's something that I think most people living in New York State may not know. And even in the U.S., they may not know all about that. So why do you think that is, Will?
Well, I think that's just due to a lack of education about different indigenous nations throughout the U.S. A study of schools in 2012 found that about 87% of state history standards for schools failed to cover anything about Native American history after the 1900s. Education about Native Americans is so deficient that in focus groups with teachers, they rate history of nations' peoples and pre-Columbus American history and culture as 2 of the worst subjects in terms of coverage and accuracy. And what I mean by that is that they don't cover enough about those areas, and if they do cover them, the information isn't always accurate. And this lack of education about Native Americans has resulted in many Americans holding inaccurate views about Native people. For example, many Americans view Native Americans as one homogeneous group, without understanding that there are 573 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. with different languages, customs, traditions, and laws. To put things in perspective, claiming that all Native Americans are the same would be akin to claiming that all Spanish and Italian people are the same just because they come from Mediterranean countries in Europe. While it is true that they may share some similarities, most people understand that Spain's language, culture, and traditions are different from Italy's language, cultures, and traditions. And this is the same for our indigenous nations here in the US. And the reality is that most members of the indigenous community identify with their tribe first. And then as a Native American.
That's a really great analogy. Thanks, Will. So you're participating in this fellowship here at DRNY. Can you tell us why it's so important?
So the fellowship is really important to Disability Rights New York because Disability Rights New York protects and advocates for all people with disability, including our indigenous communities. Many members of our indigenous communities have disabilities. Approximately 27% of Native Americans living in the U.S. have a disability, which is a disability rate higher than any other demographic. Native Americans in the U.S. experience serious psychological distress at 1.5 times more than the general population. The indigenous community has higher rates of depression, substance abuse disorders, and high rates of suicide. The National Indian Education Association has long noted that Native American students are identified as in need of special education at higher rates than their peers, and Native American students with disabilities are also far more likely to be suspended or disciplined in school than any other demographic. The issues for Native Americans with disabilities are compounded for a number of different reasons. To start, many federal laws designed to protect people with disabilities are not always enforceable against tribal governments because of sovereign immunity. Most nation territories are located in rural and remote areas that lack public transportation systems. Some tribal communities do not have the infrastructure to support access and accommodations for people with disabilities, such as sidewalks and sidewalk ramps for wheelchair access. Some tribal communities also lack high-speed internet or the means to acquire assistive technology for people with disabilities. And another general issue is that there are tribal, state, and federal programs that are geared to help Native Americans with disabilities, but it is often complicated figuring out who's actually able to avail themselves of the benefits of these different programs. But one thing that is important for us to know here at Disability Rights New York is that while the tribes are sovereign governments in the eyes of the state and the federal government, their members are considered citizens of the state and of the United States overall, and are therefore entitled to the same programs as anybody else.
So, Will, you're very passionate about this project and you're doing so much here. Can you tell us why this personally is so important to you?
Sure. When I was in college, I took a class called Native American History and Activism. As part of the class, we went to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and learned about many of the issues facing the Oglala Lakota people and Native Americans generally. I learned about the number of people in the indigenous community who have disabilities and also the lack of resources there were for these individuals. The class itself really opened my eyes to the injustices suffered by the different indigenous communities throughout the country and to issues faced by people with disabilities generally. The class spurred me to take classes about civil rights and constitutional law in college and in law school so that I could learn to be a better advocate for individuals with disabilities and members of our indigenous community. I wrote papers on the American Indian movement, the dark history of Native American boarding schools, and other topics. Before I went to law school, I knew that I wanted to use my legal education to advocate and fight for the rights of people in need and who need an advocate, which is why I chose to go to Notre Dame Law School, because I knew that they offered 4 different fellowships to graduating third-year law students who want to pursue a public interest career. The best part about the fellowship process was that I actually got to create my own fellowship project with a nonprofit. And when I pitched this idea of supporting Native Americans with disabilities throughout the state of New York to DRNY, they were all for it as they had been trying to do outreach to the indigenous community in New York. Notre Dame liked the fellowship project we created and offered me one of the 4 fellowships. This project is important to me because it allows me to support members of our indigenous community and people with disabilities, which is what kind of started me on this path to begin with.
And so what have you been doing so far as part of this fellowship?
First and foremost, I've been doing a lot of research about the diverse indigenous nations and communities in New York State. The more I learn, I have a lot to learn, which is why I attended all of the cultural competency trainings put on by the Native American Community Service of Erie and Niagara counties. I reached out to the different indigenous nations and different nonprofits throughout the state that support different indigenous communities, and state and federal agencies that support Native Americans in New York to let them know the different services offered by Disability Rights New York, to let them know about my fellowship project, and to learn about the services that they provide. As time goes on, I want to build trust and a strong relationship with the different indigenous communities throughout the state. So if there's a member of the indigenous community with a disability who would benefit from our free legal services, hopefully they'll know about our services and feel comfortable with coming to us for help.
That's great, Will. Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org. Tune in next time where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed caption version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel.